All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here. A very, very warm welcome to you all on behalf of the European Liberal Forum, the Meester Hans van Mierlo Foundation, Flores, and D66 International. It's a pleasure to have you all here at this event on the digital future, Europe's role in the global battle for AI. So, in my favorite episode of Black Mirror, Miley Cyrus plays a singer-songwriter called Ashley O, who is subdued into a coma by her aunt because the aunt wants to be able to control her songwriting skills. And so she wants to be able to control her mind. So somehow she's technologically able to read the songs from Ashley's mind. And at a certain point, Ashley O's consciousness is transferred to a robot that is built in her own image. And I'm sorry to spoil this for you, but Ashley the robot eventually manages to rescue the real Ashley from her evil aunt. So it's often these stories about technology or robots that really appeal to us. They're fascinating, they're scary, and they're often absurd at the same time. Yet they also distract us from the conversations that we should actually have about technology and the fundamental questions that urgently need public and political debate. Often, these debates are dominated by these extreme positions on AI. On the one hand, we have those who believe that AI is a quick fix to big societal problems, such as the climate crisis. And on the other hand, we have the people who believe that AI is an existential risk for humankind. So who here in the audience considers themselves to be a techno-optimist? All right, that's a lot. And a techno-pessimist? Oh, okay, not bad. And who is just right in the middle? Okay, I see some double hands maybe. So the problem with these extreme positions is that they tend to overlook the present. They focus less on the impact that technology has right now and the fact that the benefits are distributed unequally. They also tend to overlook the fact that what seems good to one might seem awful to someone else. And thirdly, they sometimes forget that technology is not something that just happens to us, but something that is always decided and created by humans. So tonight we're steering away from the pros and cons of technology, but discuss some more fundamental questions. So what is at stake within this global battle for AI? Why is European regulation of AI so important? Does regulation indeed hamper innovation, or do these two actually go hand in hand? With the European elections just around the corner, tonight we discuss Europe's role in the global battle for AI. My name is Laura de Vries, and I work as a researcher at the Hans van Mierlo Foundation, and I'll be your host this evening. Before I introduce you to our keynote speaker, Annie Bradford, I'll first give the floor to the Executive Director of the European Liberal Forum to welcome you tonight. Please welcome Alva Finn.
It's very nice to be here in Rotterdam to talk about one of the most important issues that we're going to face in the European elections. We've just seen a host of different regulations adopted at EU level. The AI Act, we have the Digital Services Act and the Digital Marketing Act. So these are things that we are taking on at EU level altogether with other member states. We're digital and tech optimists at the European Liberal Forum, so I was very happy to see that I would say the majority of this crowd is optimistic. We, as the European Liberal Forum, are the network of foundations, including our partners here today, D66 International, Hans van Mierlo Stichting, but also Flores. They are doing a series of events for us, all about the future of Europe's digital agenda. So I'm very happy that we can bring together, the Swedish perspective, but also the Dutch perspective on what the future of our digital agenda should look like. At the European Liberal Forum, we work a lot on things like AI, but we'll also be onboarding MEPs, hopefully successful MEPs, D66 MEPs coming to the European Parliament on what the future of AI looks like, global governance of AI, but also things like critical infrastructure around sustainability and the future of our competitiveness and climate change at European level. So if you're interested in any of our work, you can follow us on X. You can also follow us on at our website. We have a podcast where we talk a lot about these issues around technology, the future of technology. And yeah, I really hope that you enjoy particularly Professor Bradford's keynote speech. It should be illuminating. And keep thinking about, she coined the phrase the Brussels effect. Keep thinking about the European elections while you're standing here and sitting here today and thinking about the future and the solutions that we can have as Liberals. Because as Liberals, I think technology, and we can be tech forward in a way that other parties can't. So we should have these narratives in our mind as we go into the European elections. So thanks a lot, and yeah, enjoy the debate.
Thank you very much. So now it's my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Annie Bradford. So Annie Bradford is, and I hope she's coming on the screen soon. Annie Bradford is Professor of Law and International Organizations at Columbia Law School. She's also hi Annie Bradford, it's so good to have you here.
Hello, good to see you.
I was just starting to introduce you.
Perfect, excellent.
So she's also a director for Columbia's European Legal Studies Center and a senior scholar at the Institute for Global Business at Columbia Business School. She's an expert on European Union law, digital regulation, international trade law, and comparative and international antitrust law. Bradford is the author of The Brussels Effect, How the European Union Rules the World, which was named one of the best books of 2020 by Foreign Affairs. Her most recent book, Digital Empires, The Global Battle to Regulate Technology, was published by Oxford University Press in September 2023 and was recognized as one of the best books of that year by Financial Times. Please welcome Annie Bradford.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I assume you hear me okay. So what a terrific conversation you are convening tonight. I think there are very few issues that could be more consequential for the next chapter in European politics and the policy that will really be shaping the lives of individuals and the future societies across Europe. So thank you so much for the opportunity to share the conversation with you for the next half an hour that we have together. I have a few slides, so let me just share them with you. Here we go. Excellent. So when you talk about digital future, I wanted to suggest that we have digital futures. So there are some fundamental choices that we will be making about the digital policy, which then will shape our digital economy and our digital society. So this is a key argument in the digital empires. And let me now just walk you through some of the key arguments of that work. So I start from the assumption that there's now increasingly a global consensus that technology needs to be regulated. But there is no global consensus on what that regulation ought to look like. So I think that there are three primary ways that we can think about digital governance. We have the American, what I call a market-driven regulatory model. We have the Chinese state-driven model, and the European rights-driven regulatory model. So let me just walk you through the basic assumptions underlying each of these models. The American market-driven model prioritizes free market, free speech, free internet, incentives to innovate. It reserves only a minimalist role for the government and in practice hands over the governance of technology to the tech companies themselves. So it is a techno-optimist, techno-libertarian view of the world. The Chinese have a somewhat different view. The Chinese government is very focused on making China a technological superpower. And under its state-driven regulatory model, it is prepared to deploy state resources to achieve that goal. But China is also deploying technology as a tool for surveillance and censorship and propaganda in an effort to entrench the political power of the Communist Party and ensure social stability within the nation. So in this conversation, Europeans are often portrayed as being forced to choose between the American and the Chinese digital worlds, lacking a robust technology industry on its own. But I don't think the Europeans can choose between the US and China, nor are they forced to choose between the two. For the Europeans, the Chinese model is simply too oppressive, but the American model is too permissive. So the Europeans have chosen their own third path forward. They have pursued a digital model of governance that rests on this notion of human-centric digital transformation, where the protection of fundamental rights of individuals, the preservation of democratic structures of the society, and a pursuit of a more fair digital economy takes the center stage. So the Europeans are prepared to redistribute power away from the large platforms to the smaller companies, to individual users, and to the society at large. So under this model, the key assumption is that the tech company cannot be left to their own devices to govern technology. That's why the Europeans have pursued a very ambitious digital regulatory agenda. Most recently, the AI Act as the world's first comprehensive binding AI regulation, but also the Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, coming in the heels of the GDPR as one of the gold standards that the EU has produced for the world. But if these are now the three primary ways that we can think about regulating artificial intelligence and technology more broadly, one question that you may ask is that why would I describe these three leading regulatory and technology powers empires? Empire is a big word, it is a provocative word, and I use it more metaphorically. But it is also helpful for us in understanding what is going on, because none of these three regulatory models are confined to the jurisdictions themselves. Instead, each of them is actively exporting their respective regulatory models abroad. But they're all exporting something different. So the United States is primarily exporting the private power of its tech companies. These tech companies were set free to take over the world, and that is exactly what they have done. Companies like Meta's Facebook now has over 3 billion users in 160 countries around the world. This is part of the American digital empire, where users around the world are being shaped by the services and products produced by these American tech companies, which then embed this techno-libertarian ethos into those products and those services. And this is now very much true in the wave of AI revolution and the dissemination of AI technologies, many of which now are being again traced to the Silicon Valley, the heart of the American digital empire. Chinese are exporting something different. They are primarily exporting what I call infrastructure power. So Chinese tech companies are building 5G networks, data centers, undersea cables, smart cities, safe cities, exporting AI-driven surveillance technologies along the digital Silk Road that reaches across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and even parts of Europe. And in the process of building these digital backbones for the societies, they are also entrenching the reach of the Chinese digital authoritarian empire. So what are the Europeans then exporting? The Europeans are exporting this superpower they have, which is regulation. Europeans are more famous for regulating than developing technologies. And they often have become the global regulator through this phenomenon that I have called the Brussels effect. So the Brussels effect refers to the European Union's unilateral ability to regulate the global marketplace. The EU is one of the largest and wealthiest consumer markets in the world. And there are very few global companies that can afford not to trade in the EU. So as the price for entering the European consumer market, these companies need to follow European regulations, including digital regulations like the GDPR or now in the future, the AI Act. But often these companies decide that it is in their interest to extend the European regulation across their global conduct or their global production because they want to avoid the cost of producing multiple different products for multiple different markets. So there's benefits of standardizing, and often they standardize to the most stringent regulation, which is the European regulation, in order to avoid the cost of complying with multiple different regulatory regimes. So now if the first argument that I hope to have persuaded you is that Europe is also an empire, this is not just about the United States versus China. My second argument is that we are not seeing the global digital economy being splintered into three separate spheres of influence. Instead, the empire's influence is often overlapping. There are many markets around the world where you at the same time have the presence of the US tech companies, the Chinese digital infrastructure, and European regulations regulating that infrastructure and those tech companies. But that also means that these empires are colliding. They are coming into conflict in many of those markets. And that then leads to various battles. So I distinguish between two types of battles. We witness horizontal battles and vertical battles. The horizontal battles are the battles between the empires themselves. The most prominent one being the US-China tech war that has now received an even greater sort of escalation and intensity due to the race for AI supremacy. So this battle is a battle for technological, economic, ideological, geopolitical, and one day potentially also military supremacy. And technology, in particular AI, is at the very heart of this battle. But there's also another battle that is in that horizontal space and that is very significant, which is the regulatory battle between the Americans and the Europeans. So US tech companies have come to the European markets, and Europeans take the view that often they have become too powerful. They are abusing their dominance in the marketplace, infringing competition. They are exploiting the data of the Europeans for their commercial purposes and potentially even pass it on to the US national security agencies. And they are generally managing or failing to manage their online platforms in ways that leave Europeans surrounded by hate speech and disinformation. So in response to all of this, the Europeans are asserting themselves and their regulatory power over American companies, which then has led many in the US to say that, look, it's not our companies that are overreaching, it's your regulators that are overreaching. But that is a fundamental battle that we are witnessing between the differences of the American market-driven model, the model that allows for greater surveillance, that does trust the markets more, and then the European model that is much more concerned of data privacy and much more willing to engage the government powers to restrain these companies. But at the same time, we are witnessing these horizontal battles. We also witness various vertical battles. And these are the battles between the governments on one hand and tech companies on the other. Europeans have been very much leading this battle, being the ones who have taken the initiative with their ambitious regulatory initiatives and pursuing cases against these companies. China recently also engaged in a rather dramatic tech crackdown in its own market. But even the United States is now rethinking its techno-libertarian convictions. If you look at the various public opinion surveys, American citizens want more regulation. The US Congress, that is so polarized, that doesn't really agree on anything, agrees on two things. First, that China is a problem. Second, that the big tech is a problem. And there are now bipartisan attempts to insert more regulation so that the US could also approach this vertical battle with greater vigor. But it's important for us to understand that the vertical and horizontal battles are interrelated. And they intersect in the ways that we will see actually more restraint in these battles. So even if the United States is now considering engaging into that vertical battle, that conversation takes place in the shadow of the horizontal battle, which means that the US is always going to be more cautious because it does not want to weaken the very asset it has in the horizontal battle against China. So the US is fearful in setting back these companies that it needs when it wants to battle for technological supremacy against Chinese. So let me now move to the question that probably interests most of you, which is who wins these battles? So I'm willing to make a couple of predictions here. And my first prediction is that the American market-driven model is weakening. It is increasingly losing the ideological battle for the vision of the correct way to think about digital governance. So there's governments and citizens around the world who have initially embraced the products and services and often still continue very much to use them. But they are also increasingly conscious of the various harmful effects that can be attributed to these US companies. There's increasingly a view that these companies have become too powerful. They exert the kind of economic power, political power, cultural, societal power that they can no longer responsibly handle. And the governments around the world are now increasingly asserting their regulatory powers. Even as I mentioned, the United States itself is no longer fully committed to its market-driven model. If that is happening to the market-driven model, in many ways, that is good news for the European model, because now we have a growing number of governments that are coalescing behind a variation of the European rights-driven model. So in many ways, there is now increasingly the view that the Europeans have been on the right side of history in battling the excessive power of these tech companies, that it is the European model that best protects public interest and achieves a more fair digital economy, something that many think is worth emulating. But I have three concerns about the European model that may ultimately dim any victory that the Europeans could be claiming in this battle. So one is this concern of innovation. So the European model is good at protecting rights, but it is less certain that this model is compatible with innovation. So many, if you ask a room full of people to name a European tech company, I know this room could name the ASML, but there are many rooms where they may come up with Spotify, but the list is awfully short. But they are very quick to name the GDPR. So the Europeans are indeed more famous for regulating technologies than generating technologies. And I don't think anybody was surprised that OpenAI's ChatGPT emanated from the Silicon Valley and not from any European country. So it is true that the Europeans are behind the Americans and the Chinese in developing technologies. And I am very worried about the general state of European tech innovation. But I don't think the reason can be found in European commitment to rights-driven regulation. There are more fundamental differences between the US and the EU that explain why the US is doing so much better. So let me walk you through the four reasons that I think are particularly important here. The first is that there is no digital single market in the European Union. It is hard for tech companies to scale across the EU when they face different languages, different cultural expectations that shape consumer demand, and importantly, still different legal frameworks. Second, it's not only the absence of the digital single market, but also the absence of a capital markets union. There are no integrated deep capital markets in the EU that would allow these tech companies to fund their innovations. They do really well in the first few funding rounds, but as soon as they need more money, they need to turn to US venture capital or they are acquired by the US tech giants. Third, attitudes and legal frameworks that discourage risk-taking in Europe. European countries have some of the most punitive bankruptcy laws in the world. Failure in Europe is often fatal, but you cannot pursue disruptive innovations if you are not allowed to fail. and then be given a second chance to try again. So in Europe, there's a lot of stigma also around failure. Whereas in the US, in Silicon Valley, it's built into the venture capital model. You try something really hard, of course, you're going to be failing sometimes. But then you go and raise more money and they give you more money because they think that, well, you seem to be working on big things. And that is absolutely crucial if you want entrepreneurs to take risks and pursue disruptive innovations, including now in the AI space. And the fourth reason is that you cannot be a leading innovator unless you have access to the world's leading innovators. And here again, Americans have been much more successful than the Europeans in harnessing the global talent to benefit their technology sector. So if you look at the leading AI companies in the world and how many of them actually have an immigrant founder, that is a really powerful story. If you look at where the most AI talent resides, there was a recent most prestigious AI conference where the researchers submitted papers from all over the world. And the best 20% of those papers were accepted. When we then look at who actually produced those papers, 60% of those come from the United States, Stanford and Google being the two leading institutions. But then when you look at the place from which the researchers in these US institutions got their undergraduate degree from, the picture is quite different. 29% came from China, but work in the US institutions, 20% from the US, and 18% from Europe. So there's massive brain drain to the US from China in particular, but also from Europe. So over 50% of over $1 billion startups in the US have an immigrant founder. And if we focus for a moment, even in the household names, the biggest tech companies and their founders. So Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, son of a Syrian immigrant. Jeff Bezos, who is then a founder of Amazon, second generation Cuban. If you look at Elon Musk, the founder of Tesla, South African. Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google, is Russian. And Eduardo Saverin, the co-founder of Facebook, he is Brazilian. So this is not the story of the Europeans pursuing digital regulation, which is why they are not innovating. It is that the Europeans have failed to replicate these other pillars of the tech ecosystem that have benefited American innovation. So that would be certainly a key to-do list for the next Commission and the next European Parliament to focus on these other tech pillars in addition to then implementing the regulatory agenda. So if I'm not worried about the Europeans over-regulating, I am much more worried about the European model because I think they are under-regulating. In many ways, the Europeans are not doing that well in implementing, in enforcing those regulations. So we know that there have been over 10 billion in fines against Google by the European Commission. What has happened to Google's market share? Hardly anything. We know that the GDPR is a very strong regulation on paper, but we still have constant deficiencies in the enforcement. So that, I think, is a bigger threat to the European model. And the third threat is that European model is very popular in the democratic world, but it holds very little appeal in the authoritarian and authoritarian leading world. And in that world is getting bigger every day. And in that world, it's the Chinese state-driven model that these countries want to emulate. They don't want the European rights. They don't want the European regulatory model that enhances as opposed to undermines democracy. So let me now leave you with this concern that I have. The biggest battle that we are facing is the battle over the future of liberal democracy. And that battle in the tech space can be lost in one of two ways. One is if the Europeans and their techno-democratic allies lose the horizontal battle to China, and the world is turning more digital authoritarian. And there are a couple of reasons why that might happen. So the Chinese model is doing really well. And I give you two reasons why it's very hard for the US and the EU to persuade the countries not to follow China. So the first reason is that this infrastructure power is fundamental. China is providing these countries a path to digital development that they desperately need. Chinese infrastructure is good and it's affordable, and the Europeans and Americans often are not providing an alternative. There's another reason, and I'm very uncomfortable making this argument, but I think it needs to be recognized. China has shown to the world that freedom is not necessary for innovation. They have created a thriving tech economy without being free. And that's why it is hard for the Europeans to go to the rest of the world, to those authoritarian and authoritarian-leaning countries, and warn them against emulating the Chinese state-driven model and saying that, look, you copy China and all you get is control. You will not see economic growth. You will not see innovation. They look at China and say, looks like we can have both. So one way to lose this battle over democracy is to lose that horizontal battle to China. But I also invite you to think that that battle can also be lost if the Europeans and Americans lose the vertical battle to the tech companies. That is also not a digital economy that is grounded in democratic governance. And that is something that we need to be very careful for, because America is now so polarized that the Congress is incapable largely of legislating. China doesn't have a hard time legislating. If the Chinese government decides it is time to crack down on the big tech, it is time to crack down on the big tech. Europeans can legislate, but the question is whether the Europeans can effectively enforce their regulations, or whether all those battles ultimately are hollow if that rights-driven regulatory model is not entrenched in the market outcomes. Chinese government, again, doesn't have a hard time enforcing. Chinese government doesn't face the situation where the Chinese governments are dragging the government into independent courts and battle them for a decade. That is what the Europeans are facing for good reason, because there's rule of law and there is due process. But ultimately, if the Americans and the Europeans cannot show to themselves and to the world that there is an effective liberal democratic way to govern technology, we are forced to concede that digital economies either governed by authoritarians, whereas democratic governments are destined to fail in that same endeavor, or it's governed by tech companies. And neither is consistent with the principles of liberal democracy. So I'm going to leave you with this choice that we all need to be thinking about. I think it's a choice we face in the European elections. It's a choice we face in our national political conversations. It's a choice we need to face as individuals, as governments, as tech companies, as investors, as to what is the digital future that we want, and whether ultimately that digital future is one that empowers, reinforces, and revitalizes democracy, or whether it is the one that undermines them. None of those choices have been made for us, but I think it is for us to understand the salience and the consequences of those choices that we will be making. So let me end it here, and I would welcome any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Anu Bradford, for sharing your thoughts and expertise. And I think there are many questions also popping into your heads, probably. In mine, they do. I'll just start with asking you one question, and then we'll turn to the public, to the audience. So my question actually concerns this idea of techno-protectionism that you also discuss in your book. And you seem to warn for this rise of techno-protectionism within Europe as well. So can you maybe tell us a little bit more about what does techno-protectionism look like in Europe? Who is arguing, from which side does it come? Who is arguing for this techno-protectionistic policies? And why shouldn't we go that direction? That would be my first question.
So it is a terrific question, and I think one that I think will be one of the most difficult ones to solve by the next Commission and the next Parliament. Because ultimately, it's the question of how do we de-risk Europe in the world where the geopolitics is increasingly defining our economic policy, and we mainly worry about economic security. And I think that is we cannot be naive. It is a reality we are facing. There's no going back to a completely open heyday of globalization, maximized international order where we can trust our trading partners. But increasingly, we need to make technology policy in the shadow of escalating US-China tech war, where the US is also increasingly protectionist. China has been a protectionist all along. And I would say that now I see US and the EU both increasingly playing Beijing's game. We see export controls, investment restrictions, inbound, outbound, massive subsidy races. And this is a hard game for Europe to play because China is good at this. We are not as good at this. And ultimately, I am not sure this is the path to European digital sovereignty and competitiveness. So the announcement that the Europeans are now investing over 40 billion in semiconductors, that's a lot of money. And at best, that means that the Europeans are no longer 90%, but only 80% dependent on foreign semiconductors. So the subsidy route is extremely expensive to pursue, and it is unlikely to give us the kind of independence that we would need if we really wanted to consider ourselves as strategically autonomous. So that's why I'm focusing much more on this idea that if we, for instance, have rampant subsidy races, we risk unraveling the crown jewel of Europe, which is the single market, which is the foundation of the competitiveness of the European companies. So I would rather encourage us to relentlessly invest in the pillars of European competitiveness, that digital single market, that capital markets union. Let's rewrite the bankruptcy laws. Let's make sure we can tap into the global talent and make Europe a desirable destination. So that doesn't mean that we cannot do any de-risking and that we can fully rely on foreign partners, but we need to do it very mindful of the costs and risks involved. We need to hedge, we need to build multiple partnerships as opposed to find ourselves being vulnerable and too dependent, including on our political adversaries. But I just think we can also risk overdoing it. And why are we having that conversation? I think France is very much leading that conversation. Protectionism, industrial policy comes very easily to France, but France is also better able to navigate that than a smaller country like the Netherlands or my own native country, Finland. We need the single market more. We cannot be pouring massive subsidies into our companies the way that the big member states are able to do that. So I am just asking for caution and just a real conversation of the consequences of protectionism if the Europeans are embracing that. And if I can add one more thing, if you take the Brussels effect seriously, you need to realize it is a tool to export good and bad regulations alike. Europe can become the major exporter of techno-protectionism if we are converting our digital regulations in the tool for protectionism. If we like to think about merger control as a tool for building European national champions, what happens when a Dutch company goes to Brazil and tries to acquire a Brazilian target? Well, they may like to be national champions as well. And we might be the reason that they are now encouraged to pursue that route.
Thank you so much. It sounds like a very clear message also to liberals in Europe. So I'm looking at the audience now, and we have some people with microphones walking around. Yeah? I see a question over here.
Yes, thank you, Anu, for your interesting talk and your book. I have a question. You say that European regulation isn't the reason Europe is lacking or lagging behind. But thinking about that regulation, are there still blind spots in regulation in Europe, especially in terms of curtailing market power? Is there something we can do to regulate even better?
So absolutely, even though I am a proponent of regulation, that doesn't mean that all regulation is good, all regulation is optimal, but neither is all innovation. So we also need to think about what kind of innovation we are encouraging with our regulation. If we are uncomfortable with the surveillance capitalism of Google, why should we try to regulate in a way that we try to create a European Google? So China is leading in facial recognition surveillance technologies, but they are comfortable in subjecting the whole population into mass surveillance. We are not comfortable with that. So that is not the model for us and how we think about innovation. Some blind spots that we have is that if I criticize, for instance, the GDPR, one obvious criticism is that it was disproportionately burdening the small and medium-sized enterprises. Google doesn't have a hard time complying with the GDPR. It's the small companies that really, and often European companies for that reason, that found it much costlier. So the perverse side effect was that it was actually further entrenching the power of the big tech companies that can have the advantage in not being able to, not facing the same kind of disproportionate compliance cost. So that's why I was heartened with the asymmetrical approach to regulation that the DMA reflects, only targeting the largest gatekeepers, or the Digital Services Act that applies to everybody, but that has additional obligations to the companies that can pose systemic risk. And that is already to some extent also embedded into the AI Act and the generative AI and how that is being regulated. So that, I think, gives me confidence that the Europeans are able to learn from mistakes, because we really need to be mindful that regulation is particularly costly for the small and medium-sized companies. And that is what the majority of the European tech sector is about.
Clear. Thank you very much. Other questions here? Yeah, thank you. The microphone is coming.
Okay, sorry. Hi. My name is Jochem. Thanks a lot for your book. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was very rich.
A little bit closer.
I thought it was very rich with detail, but also nuanced and a great framework. When it comes to the US and the potential for the US to regulate AI, you mentioned the fact that the US population is in favor of regulating AI. But if we look at the measures that are coming out currently, they're mostly state-driven, right? There's no consensus in Washington to drive anything forward substantially when it comes to legislation. And if you look at some of the things that have come out, like the executive order by Biden's administration, but also the recent roadmap by the Senate, they would be haphazard, I would say. If you look at the details, you know, the way that they are going to really impact companies is meager. So I was just curious if you could assess how you feel this is going and to what extent there's going to be, in due course, really some power in regulating the companies that aligns with the general interest of the US electorate.
So very good. There certainly is a discrepancy between what the public wants and what the government is delivering. So if you look at the conversation, even political conversation has shifted, but we have very little to show for in terms of actual binding regulation that would really constrain the behavior of these companies. So yes, the executive order on AI, over 100 pages, tasking 25 different federal agencies, it is not a market-driven manifesto. It does show that the US is shifting. But ultimately, when you look at it closely or compare it to the EU's AI Act, it is only so strong. It is still primarily guidance and voluntary measures. And I think we have shown that these companies ultimately will not respect voluntary measures. The profits are just too tempting, they are just too alluring, and they will not make the same kind of investments into the guardrails because of the heightened competition in this space. So in that sense, I would like to see much more ambition from the US government that is less deferential to the tech companies, but there are a couple of reasons why that is not happening. So one is that the lobbying in the US is still massive. The logic of lobbying is very different because of the role of money in the US elections. So the US congressmen need to remain sensitive to the business interests because that's how they fund their next re-election. And the lobbying is particularly fierce in this particular space. Second, yes, there is a concern that the public and the politicians have about tech companies, but that concern may even be outweighed by the concern over China. And it is a very effective message to say that, look, if you curtail these companies' ability to develop these technologies, we are destined to lose that tech race. And that is going to be a national security threat. That's going to be ceding the geopolitical dominance to China. And that is going to set us back in terms of our economic opportunities. So the counter arguments are being also entertained with such a sort of vigorous defense that it is hard for even the well-intentioned politicians who would like to regulate to ultimately be able to generate as constraining regulations. So we are seeing something also from the enforcement side, but that is a very piecemeal way of trying to regulate. But I am just less optimistic that there's going to be a major regulatory overhaul where Congress is the key player. I'm more optimistic that the states are taking the lead, the way California took the lead with data privacy. So we see some rather encouraging initiatives at the state level, and that might ultimately then push the pressure also to the federal level.
All right, thank you. Do we have one final question from the audience? I have one short question myself. Sorry, I can't leave it. To what extent do you think the Brussels effect will actually take place for the AI Act? Because we saw Sam Altman saying last January in Davos, he was sort of implying that he might actually differentiate in his products or, in ChatGPT and differentiate the output concerning different individuals or different countries. So to what extent do you think that might actually hamper the Brussels effect for the AI Act?
So AI is so multifaceted that I don't think there's going to be a single answer. Certain aspects of AI development most likely will be affected by the Brussels effect, whereas others are such where we can see the segmentation, that there are going to be different AI-driven algorithms and products and services developed for different markets. But there's still something about the fundamental logic that speaks towards there being some degree of Brussels effect, which is that generally the more data you have to train your models, the better they perform. So it is costly if you then need to carve out all the data you would have from Europe, which you couldn't use because you are bound by the Europe's AI Act, and then recreate your models and throw away that data if you do that in other markets. Maybe there will be synthetic data, maybe there will be data that is geographically more relevant for the kind of population that you are developing products for, where the European data is not that valuable, but it is a lot of data to throw away. And that, I think, suggests, and to some AI developers that I have discussed, they say that they are also preemptively responding to the changing regulatory expectations of other markets. So they see that, look, we may be able to technically differentiate, but what the Europe is asking us to do is resetting expectations in other markets as well, where the consumers want to have the same kind of rights respected, where the legislators say that, look, if you have the way to make sure that your algorithms are not biased, why would you not then take the same measures for the algorithms that you're running in our markets as well? So I think it's not going to be probably a single answer that all Brussels effect or no Brussels effect, and partially it will be the business decisions, partially it is that the regulators around the world are watching very closely what the Europeans are doing, and then emulating their own regulatory systems, which can then trigger what I call this de jure Brussels effect through regulatory emulation.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your contribution, and you, Bradford. Sorry, yeah, it's lost. Yeah, thank you. I wanted to say have a nice evening, but she's already gone. Thank you very much also for asking those interesting questions. So now we're going to the panel discussion, and I'm going to introduce our panel speakers of tonight. So I'm starting with Alexandra van Huffelen. You can come and take a seat if you like. So Alexandra van Huffelen, she probably doesn't need an introduction if I look at the audience, but she's outgoing State Secretary for Digitalization and Kingdom Relations in the Netherlands. As State Secretary, she develops the Dutch policy on digitalization, for instance, through the working agenda on value-driven digitalization. Central in this policy are safety, privacy, and non-discrimination, and enhancing the digital literacy of people. Thanks to Alexandra van Huffelen, the Netherlands now has, amongst other things, an algorithm register and a fundamental rights impact assessment for algorithms. Please, a warm applause for Alexandra van Huffelen. As a second panelist, we have Haroon Sheikh. You can also join the sofa if you like. Haroon Sheikh is a senior researcher at the Netherlands Scientific Council for Government Policy, DRR, and endowed professor strategic governance of global technologies at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. Haroon Sheikh is the author of The Rise of the East, Eurasia and the New World Order, Embedding Technopolis and Hydropolitics. He's a regular contributor to leading Dutch newspapers NRC Handelsblad and het Financiële Dagblad. And in April this year, he gave his inaugural lecture at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam titled The Victory of Politics. And then we have Jessica Dorsey. She is an assistant professor of international and European law at Utrecht University with expertise in international humanitarian law and human rights law. Her current research focuses on the legitimacy of military targeting operations in light of the increasing autonomy in warfare. In this context, she leads the Realities of Algorithmic Warfare project, and since April this year, she is also an expert member at the Global Commission on Responsible Artificial Intelligence in the Military Domain. Very warm welcome to you. So I would actually like to start with asking you for a reflection on what Anu Bradford just told us. So Alexandra, perhaps you would like to start with sharing your thoughts?
Yes, and I just came back from Brussels because we had the Telecom Council today and voted the AI Act, so it's now official. And I'm with her when she's telling us that the European model is a model that is very good. It shows that regulation can work, but I'm also with her when she says we need to improve on that regulation. And the one thing that we discussed today was also about implementation, because we have now made all these regulation, but it's only going to work if it's implemented well in a way that is going to work for all kinds of companies and organizations, if we're really going to enforce it and make sure that it does what it's supposed to do. The other argument that we discussed today is also looking a bit on the future. So I was very happy that she was also saying, how can we improve the European model? And that is by making sure that we do things that she didn't really talk about so much. It's not only invest in saying, making new Googles or European versions of that, but two things that we discussed, or three I would say. One is to invest in infrastructure, to make sure that everything is connected, that people are connected to the web, that there's compute, that we know how to do this, that also smaller companies and organizations can build on it. The second thing that we discussed was about making sure that we attract more talent. A discussion that is also in the present political scheme here very important. And another thing that we very much also discussed was about the idea of creating digital commons, which is another model than just companies or governments. It's in between. It's basically actually how the internet was created, not as something, you know, created by a private company or by a government, but by a community of people. So those three things are the things we discussed today, and I find very important also looking forward and learning and from what Anu was telling us. Yeah. Do you already see examples of those common the digital commons? Yeah, Mastodon is one. Okay. And there's many other examples, but it's something that is not so big yet, but something that more and more people are interested in, because we're disliking social media platforms more and more. Because they take all our data, because of the way that they influence the companies, they influence children, they have an effect on, you know, their design is so addictive that people spend too much time, too much money and so on them. So yes, there is examples, but I think we should work on stimulating that far more.
Also from the government, so the government has a role.
Yeah, by providing the space, and that is also what she was saying. So make sure that there's the infrastructure, there's compute, there is a possibility for people who like to create something like that, to build on these digital commons or public commons, yeah.
Interesting, thank you so much. Haroon, can you share your thoughts with us?
Yeah, maybe just also to build on this, I think this is really important to really look at those alternative models. The Netherlands is quite good at this also. I mean, we have projects like public spaces, identity management, alternative systems. I think there's really a lot to be won here. Overall, I mean, I find her very, very inspiring. So I think what she said is, I agree really mostly with with the argument she's making. I think it's also really important that the point she makes, innovation is not hindered by regulation in itself.
Yeah.
I think I hear this all the time. Wherever you are, it's like, oh, that's not the reason. And I'm not sure about all the four ones that she describes. I would really also emphasize the role of patient capital. It's not just a capital union, because we have enough capital in Europe. I mean, there is capital, but we don't have patient capital. We don't have capital that says, invest in something for 20 years without making a profit. The Americans have venture capitalists, the Chinese have a state that says, invest because the 5-year plans tells you to. And we don't have that, and that makes it really difficult for a company to pour billions and billions in R&D over the long term to create these kind of platforms. But I mean, I think this is a really important argument she makes. Maybe just one more thing to add. I think it is in her book, but maybe to bring in some nuance, I would say she clearly, I mean, there are 3 primary models. I think it's also really important to look at what's going on in the rest of the world. Nobody else really has a complete model, but I would say what Russia is developing is different from China, and they're actually competing in the developing world. Because I don't think authoritarian governments all around the world will take over the Chinese model. It's simply too expensive, and it's too complex. I mean, many poor African countries cannot censor their entire internet. They don't have the capacity. So they will use a Russian model, which uses simpler tech and mostly legal instruments to intimidate people, which is, I think, a different model than what China is exporting. But also we have different allies. If you look at countries like South Korea and Japan, which also have their own tech companies and different models. And I think it's interesting to also bring in those nuances to see, well, we can broaden our own allies here.
I see very much also the Asian countries. So there is this group of Asian countries which are working together in a group called ASEAN.
Yeah.
And so it's Singapore driving very much there. And they are far more following the European model.
Right.
With a bit more of innovation and capital maybe, but they're not following the Chinese model.
Exactly, and I think there's a lot to be won from looking at those countries, the ASEAN countries, South Korea as well. I mean, they are tilting more in our direction. I think we have something interesting to offer there. India is an interesting example. It's somewhere in the middle, but they are very rigid in keeping the Chinese out. They're also very fearful of US companies. So I think there's possibly something to be won there with all the problems that are also there. And maybe one final thing I would also like to say, there are indeed these different models, but we also mustn't forget that it's not just our democratic model and then the Chinese authoritarian model. It's also within our countries that the authoritarian impulse is increasing. I mean, Bradford says it in her book, but I think it's important really to emphasize. If we have Trump in the White House, we really are in a completely different world in terms of exporting a rights-driven model.
Yeah.
So it's also within our group that we also need to look at these distinctions.
Yeah, thank you. Jessica, what's your take on Anu Bradford's talk?
Like the other 2 speakers, I really share in celebrating how she very clearly and concisely spells out the differences in the approaches. I think that's really helpful to understand a contextual look at why we're sitting where we're sitting, how we got here. From my perspective, I look at one niche of this AI discussion, and that's the military use of AI in ways that are contrary to a rights-based approach. Oftentimes, this is inherent to how defense departments are looking at these issues. They have different perspectives by the nature of the work that they do. I can only underscore the need, not just in Europe, but internationally, to look at AI in the military domain from a human-centric perspective that echoes a lot of the rights-based, the fundamental rights-based approaches, and maybe echoing some of your points regarding the patient investment, but also from a military perspective, the tactical patience. We're in such a hurry. AI offers speed and scale in every sector. And you can have value-based judgments about whether that's a good thing, a bad thing, or you can be ambivalent about it. The speed and scale disaffords us the ability to think comprehensively about some of these issues. The rapidity with which everything's developing, we were just talking about at dinner. Yeah. It's our jobs to keep up with the latest, and it's very difficult to do so because every week there's a new trend or something to follow, a new distraction, and that doesn't give us the space, I think, that we need to really ask fundamental questions, maybe philosophical questions. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to fight wars? What is the nature of war? What is our place as humans within it? Does farming out decision-making to machines further distancing us from battlefields? Is that the kind of war we're comfortable fighting? And those are questions that they're not easy to answer. I understand from the perspective of defense why they want to be in a hurry, speeding up the ODA loop, being able to act faster than your opponent, but at what cost? That there's no such thing as a risk-free trade-off here, and to understand the risks that are introduced by some of these technologies. I think, going back to the book, I think that's a really important discussion that we need to have early and often, and we need to continue to have that underscore the way that these technologies are developing and we're using them.
So, just building also on what you were saying, the Netherlands has very recently organized a conference on the military use of AI in Reaim. And one of the things that we're also discussing internationally, and this is a bit, we are talking here about, or I know it's talking about the three models, but we basically quite recently started up the discussions within the United Nations. And that is basically a model overarching the three models, you could say. And one of the things that I believe also the United Nations should be good at, and they're working on it, and there's involvement also from scientists from here, from the Netherlands, so Marietje Schaak is, for instance, in one of those high-level advisory boards, is to talk about creating a kind of AI non-proliferation system by the UN. So making sure that the UN is not only focusing on regulation and making sure that the regulation worldwide is going to be consistent with each other, which would be super nice, and doing research together, but at least also look at this point of, the military use of AI or the use that is deriving from military, it could be super harmful for human beings. And I don't know how you look at that, but I would see a very big role for the UN also to play there, because they are overarching the three models that we are basically discussing tonight.
So perhaps could you tell something more about what is currently going on with military AI? What do you see happening?
What do I see? I see a lot of things happening, and very fast. But back to your point, I think that's right. There is a role internationally for the United Nations. The Secretary General just last year called for a treaty banning fully autonomous weapon systems. So those are weapon systems that in their critical functions select and engage targets on their own without human in the loop, as it were. And he wants that treaty by 2026. That's a very interesting deadline. That's relatively quickly to set up a treaty to get international buy-in. That process goes in parallel. So that's at the United Nations General Assembly level. There was a resolution passed last December about this. So that's inclusive. That is a global approach. There's another parallel process happening, and has been going on since 2014 at the United Nations within the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, the governmental experts on lethal autonomous systems. A lot of acronyms. Essentially, the discussions happening there have also centered around those lethal autonomous weapons systems. So far, because it is a unanimous decision-making body. You can imagine that nothing has come out of that particular process so far. I still remain optimistic about whether there will be something that might come out. The Netherlands is chairing that at the moment, and they've come up, I think, in their meetings in March, they had an innovative approach to trying to find consensus. But that's not a representative body. That is 126 countries, so it leaves out essentially a third of the globe. So bringing it within the auspices of the UN, I think, is absolutely necessary, but not the only thing. I think I'm making a lot of noises. There's a lot of work to be done at all three levels. So we're talking internationally, regionally, as well as nationally, and there needs to be complementarity within those frameworks, and that's where I think like the global commission that I'm sitting on of RE-AIM can feed into those processes to make sure that these initiatives are complementary and human-centric, and I think that that's something that needs more time to develop and to discuss rather than speeding ahead, because that's what I think we're seeing generally, back to your original question before I round off my comments here, but the speed and scale is also pushing the discussion towards sort of this arms race rhetoric. Like we have to have it before our enemies do. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing sort of this buildup that there's not really questioning that particular assumption, is that if we don't innovate, if we don't acquire this technology, we'll be left behind. Yeah. That's a really hard narrative to sort of unravel and push back on. What are we in a hurry for? Where are we? What's the hype versus the reality? Who has what systems? How are they being used? What are the regulatory frameworks? Those sort of questions. But again, maybe you have some thoughts on that as well?
Maybe just to build on that, the comment also on the need for a broad approach, a UN approach, and look at. I think that's also very important. It's something that I'm not saying Anu Bradford does this, but there is, I think, a risk. She does say, well, there is at core, what is at stake is liberal democracy. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think she's right. I think that's really important here. But I think there's also really a danger that we're seeing more often now of dividing the world into democracies and dictatorships. Okay. And that's a battle between the two of them. This is something the United States is very much pushing. This is also something we're seeing around the war in Ukraine. It's all about democracy versus dictatorship. And although this is an important aspect, where I think it's risky is because in a large part of the world, this is not the core issue for them. There are a lot of countries, call them swing states or countries in the middle. They are kind of democracies, but it's not the only thing they care about. A country, Brazil, South Africa, many countries in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, they probably would prefer democracy over a dictatorship, but they have all kinds of other development issues, issues more of basic needs. And saying, well, it's all about this group versus that group, it blinds us to the fact that also within our countries, literally our country, we have authoritarian tendencies going to politics, right? But also many other parts of the world that I think are important partners, we should get on board. And it's risky if we just divide the world into just these two groups.
The good thing is that we see them on board. So there was the process that you were also involved in that was organized by the UK in Bletchley Park, but there's the G20 and the G7, and there you can see also other models, and especially, for instance, companies like South Africa and Brazil and Japan sitting at the table and designing these models. And they, maybe not the man in the street will care about this discussion too much, but what I see is these governments are very much worrying about the digital market in terms of their economy, in terms of they're worried about disinformation, they're worried about their children not being educated well. So there is a worldwide discussion. Luckily, there's a worldwide discussion that we can have together with the ASEAN countries, with the G20, with also the Council of Europe that just recently also agreed on a treaty on AI. So I'm a bit more optimistic that these models can come more together, although I'm also with Anu that we need to worry because there is the companies that she's talking about, and we're talking about these big tech companies, basically 5 companies run by men that find it more important to have their own competition amongst themselves whether it's in a box ring or whatever ring they do, then thinking about how they are influencing the lives of people. And that's still pretty scary, because the last time I spoke to Sam Altman at Bletchley Park a few months ago, he was just basically saying that regulation is bringing us back to the Stone Age. I mean, this is a completely ridiculous argument, but if a guy like that, on the one hand says, I'm creating a technology, or my company is creating a technology that might destroy humanity, that's really what he says, and says, but regulation, no. Yeah. So that is, you know, we're not only looking at these governmental models that hopefully that we can, you know, bring together in the United Nations and all these groups, and also in the US with the states doing that. But we're looking at these companies that we should really, really check. And one of the things what we should do from Europe, as we're getting back to Europe and the new elections, is to really make sure that all the regulation that we now made, the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, and that it's really going to be enforced and implemented. Because now, I mean, we were talking about, you know, the fines are not high enough, but now it's 6% of your global turnover. That is also quite a lot of money for OpenAI or Google or some of those. So we really need to look at these companies. Basically, we find it okay that they spread products and services into our markets that are unregulated. I mean, we wouldn't accept unregulated cars, unregulated drugs, you know, medicine. We do it with this. I mean, it's crazy.
How do you look at the role of companies in the,
Yeah.
I don't know if my mic is working. I'm just going to be loud. I'm also American, so I can be loud. In the military, we're seeing this venture capital tech startup mentality that overrules everything. It's move fast and break things, but it's the things that we are breaking are humans. The civilians, it's the risk shifting from the companies, the militaries, to the civilians on the ground. The realities are, when we look at Ukraine and when we look at Gaza, how these particularly unregulated decision support systems are being deployed in an unfettered, unregulated way. This is costing lives. And you mentioned already, self-driving cars, one accident, horrific. So we pull it off and regulate the hell out of it.
yeah.
Pharmaceutical corporations, Stuart Russell's work, we make them prove it before it comes to market. But in the military space, we see completely the opposite. It's experimental nature. It's the Alex Karps of the world, selling products, promising results, and militaries wanting a piece of that pie. And I think that that's really worrying. I think your illustration from Mr. Altman, and also the last few weeks at OpenAI, why would we want a company like that, watching their track record, self-regulating? They've shown us they cannot self-regulate.
No.
So why are we leaving it to these corporations? Why is such a concentration of power in the hands of so few tech bros, if I may? And I'm trying not to be gender specific, but it's usually not tech bros.
In this field is kind of, and it's also, but it's in the, you were talking about the military examples, but I'm also super worried about children, right? So children use TikTok, Snapchat, all that. So they're super addictive in their designs. They make you buy stuff you do not want to buy. They make you, give you images that you cannot live with. We have a youth panel here in the Netherlands, but it's existing all over the world by UNICEF, and these kids are saying, I'm using my phone for 7-8 hours a day, and I actually feel bad about it, but I can't stop because the images are coming and coming. Or they use Snapchat and they're being bullied by somebody else, you know. Or they buy their Snapchat image is actually they have to buy Gucci dresses for it or something like that, you know, and then you spend another 10 euros on stupid stuff.
I mean, there is.
I would love a Gucci dress for 10 euros. But then a real one,
But I think this is indeed what's happening. I mean, there is. Big tech has been doing a vast social experiment, and it's clear in every way that they are fundamentally changing our nature and our societies. And
well-being.
And the children are the most vulnerable, but I think all of us in some way, like, what happened? what happened? We are spending most of our days on the screen now. Just a few years ago, this wasn't the case. So what are the effects of this on our brain, on our concentration, on our social habits all around? So I think that's, and I think Bradford emphasizes it's good that the US model of zero regulation, that's waning, but indeed, from the companies themselves, this libertarian spirit is alive and kicking. It is people like Sam Altman, but it's also Elon Musk with his own version of a large language model, Groker, that has no any rules in terms of good behavior. It is surrounding the whole movement around blockchain. It keeps popping up, and this is just as undemocratic as what the Communist Party of China is doing. I think that's what we really also need to worry about.
But we also need to look at the bright side of it, right? So because we need, but that's also what I find important, and one of the things that we discussed also today, because, you know, generative AI, and you are one of the advisors of the Dutch government there as well, could also bring us loads of things that can make our work easier. It can write contracts and texts for us. It can help us, you know, making services, you know, customer services better. It could help us to find new drugs more easily or treatment for diseases. So it's also that we need to look on that side. I mean, it needs to be regulated, but we definitely also need to look on how we can make sure that this technology is going to work for us. And there we have seen that there's little, you know, lights that you see, little experiments, but still too little, I would say. I would really like us to do more there. But then, of course, experiment in a way that is, you know, in a safe environment. Yeah.
Well, I saw that there were many techno-optimists in the room here, so perhaps we have some ideas in the audience. Who is a techno-optimist and has some ideas about how technology can be used for good, and what does good mean? Do we have a mic? Yeah, thank you.
Should I stand? It's maybe better, but then
Whatever you like.
It's more a dilemma whether you can have a discussion about you should interpret it as a good means for technology, and that is the dual use applications of AI and more broader technology. And where do you think traditionally the universities in the European Union have been very hesitant in doing research for a dual use application, let alone for the military or defense industry? In contrast, DARPA, the American program, has been huge and also very successful with, well, for example, contribution to developing the internet. So you could argue here that one of the reasons that we are not that far in AI and also in developing our own technology for defense, for Ukraine, for example, is that we have been so hesitant. You could also say, let's have the Brussels effect also for the military research and technology, and, well, that's universities. Because now, as European universities, we said, in principle, we don't work for dual-use technology. So I would be interested to hear your views on this dilemma.
This sounds like a question that Jessica has many thoughts about, I can imagine.
Many a thought, yeah. I think you have to talk about the investment structure for DARPA versus anything else. The United States puts everyone else to shame about the investments that they make as far as capital is concerned in defense innovation. So I'm not sure that we could recreate that. I'm not sure that that's really desirable. I think there's a hesitancy for Europe to be seen as sort of a defensive project. We're not that, if you ask people on the street. But I think if we look at the realities of the projects that are ongoing, frameworks, the joint projects that we're investing in, the EU common position on arms export, there's a lot to be said. And I am still jarred at the sort of stark absence of the EU from a regulatory perspective on issues related to military and national security. We don't want to burn our fingers on this stuff in the AI Act or in the Council of Europe's framework. We want to be robust and we want to be a leader, except in these areas, and then we allow others to eclipse us, which I'm still trying to figure out what that exactly means. I'm not quite sure. Is this a place where we should assert ourselves? I think absolutely. We have a really big and shiny market here of, depending on how you count it, 500 million to 750 million people. Before you bring your products to our market, prove that they work, right? Like, this is something we can demand of any sector, but also from a military perspective. But what I see happening that makes me worried is the insatiable appetite from defense organizations, which I understand, I'm not criticizing that whatsoever, about these kinds of technologies that can make their warfighting better, easier, more effective, their hoofdtaak 1 easier to realize, force protection easier to realize. That is very tantalizing. If these technologies are helping us do that, you want to get hold of them. But what I'm concerned about is that the lack of regulation means that innovation is unfettered. In that discussion that you highlighted, that sort of false dichotomy between innovation and regulation, Bradford also, of course, everybody's pushing back on that. The regulation puts guardrails up where innovation can flourish. And I think within the military domain, that's really important to have those conversations about where those guardrails are going to be. The Dutch military is also part of these discussions as well, about where responsible use of AI, whatever that means, we're still working on helping define that particular term. What does that mean in terms of our norms and our values? Who are we? And these are those existential questions that we have to sort of understand. So back to your question about, yes, we've seen successes from DARPA, but I don't think that we can emulate that in the European Union. I don't particularly think that that's something desirable that we do, because then I think you get into this same, like, trying to recreate an American system or an ecosystem that only could have happened in the United States, as Bradford really does a great job of explaining. That's not going to happen here. And maybe we've missed the boat in the sense of, it doesn't make sense for governments or the EU to try to take over these dual-use technologies, facial recognition, that the private companies have built better, faster, and more effectively than we could do ourselves. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't put all of our efforts into making meaningful regulation and leading from the front on these issues, rather than stepping away from military and national security issues.
One of the things that we decided today upon was also to work on midterm evaluations of the regulation that we designed. Okay. And I believe that, leaving out the military domain from the AI Act or defense industry from the AI will be one of the things that we have to discuss now, because this is going to be very important.
Do you think there's an opening for that, or are people willing to?
That's going to be difficult. So I do believe that there is an opening, and several countries want it, but we need to move, in the right direction. It will take some diplomacy in the coming time to make sure that we can have that discussion. Yeah.
Where do you think the biggest hesitancies are?
I guess basically the discussions that you are starting off, the more philosophical, what do we see in the military usage? What do we think is right and not right? But it depends from country to country. It's also the countries with their own industry are, sometimes more proactive, sometimes they do not want to. But I truly believe that this is one of the items that we need to look into if we are going to go for this midterm evaluation, although midterm is a bit crazy term, but it is important. Yeah.
Thank you. Other ideas or questions? I have one here. Alva? Oh yeah, do we have a microphone around?
Yeah, well, if you've
already have a microphone.
You talked about data commons already, but one of the things that I think we made a mistake was around GDPR is we gave access to our data, but we don't have ownership of our data. And actually we could completely release we would change the market fundamentally if we had ownership of our own data. You would maybe be able to sell it, donate it to data commons and things like that. And I think, yeah, if you just take data commons, if we were able to donate our health data, for example, then AI could come and look at your data and solve many health issues. So there are ways, I think, of wresting back control, but it also means that we need to have rights to things like data, but other areas of technology as well. So that's just one example of where if you look at it from a different perspective, you can become a tech positive person. It's just that you haven't been empowered by the digital landscape in that way yet. I know people don't want to touch GDPR, but it would be interesting to hear what you all think of that idea.
Yeah. I like it very much. So the idea of this digital commons and so on and so forth, one of the things that I find also that the next Commission, so the European Union needs to talk about, is about data, and especially also on the laws around cookies. Because I don't know, everybody knows about cookies, and I think everybody's clicking yes, 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 or most of the people do. In which way we do not, we give away all our data, although it's GDPR proof, because you consented to giving your data, although you have no idea where you're consenting to. And most of all, these consents are not fundamentally right. There's dark patterns. You're lured towards saying yes instead of saying no, and so on and so forth. So the idea of gaining back control through sharing your data in a way that you really want, changing the cookie laws, is also something that I really would like us to work on. Because right now we're just, firing up and stimulating and helping the business models that we actually do not like. Yeah.
How do you look at this, about this ownership also?
I think it's very difficult. I mean, it's something we definitely need to reconsider and think about how we can find different structures in which people have some form of more control over their data. I'm not sure which model works. Looking at it really from the perspective of AI, I think it's made even more complex. We made the GDPR in a context when we knew what kind of data represents what. Okay? My medical data is relevant for that person, so that person can see and that person cannot. What I think really AI makes this more complex is that it uses data for things we have no idea that was in the data. I mean, there are algorithms that say, well, just give me 1 minute of your face talking, and we can see if you have the onset of Parkinson's disease in the face. So we're just talking here about a nice video on Instagram or something, but you're actually sharing very personal medical data that you don't even maybe yourself.
Yeah.
And I think that's really that's going to make it even more complex. And also the question of what do I want people to do with my data? We can now distill so much information from data that we didn't know was buried in there. I mean, there's a nice example from a US taxi organization that put just some very basic information of this trip went there and this was what it cost, and put it online. So let's see what developers can do with this. Well, the first thing they did was within a few minutes, the data was de-anonymized, so they knew a lot about it. The next thing, they were connecting it with social media data and knowing who was getting in the car and getting out where. Mm-hmm. The next thing they did, they would calculate the amount a taxi driver would have to pay at the end to the IRS, because this is average day, so if they file for less tax money, they're hiding money. And they could know which driver was Muslim, because they know at certain moments the car would stop. Just a few examples from very simple data points. This car goes there. Yeah. What people can get out of it, and I think. And
now also about women that are going to another state. So it's Booking.com's information. Women going to another state to have an abortion because it's not, and so they can be. Arrested.
And this
it also relates to the question of when data actually can be transferred from tech companies, collected by tech companies, and then transferred to the government, and whether that's
and who has
So we need so much more protection than just saying yes, yes, yes to somebody on a website where you're buying a pair of socks, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, true. I see a question here. At the front.
Hi, thank you. I had a remark/question because I think I missed two really important words or concepts tonight. First of all, the environmental burden and the climate change impacts of digitalization globally, as it's also very much expanding. And secondly, Africa and the African continent. So where is what is the position of the African continent now and also in the future? How do you see that?
Thank you. Who wants to respond?
Can I take a stab at that really quick? I think that's really important from a military perspective. The footprint of militaries, not only use of AI, but also their footprint generally that hasn't been tracked, though there are increasing efforts to do so, to understand a comprehensive look at what it costs to deploy military force in places. So I think I would just underscore that that's a very important aspect that's been previously empirically not looked at, but is increasingly so. On the African point, I think that relates to a point that you raised earlier about the regional approaches, and that's why the research project that I'm running looks at the realities of the way that these military AI systems are being used, where, in which context. Oftentimes that's the Global South. But what's really interesting from the perspective of Global South nations and blocks, regional blocks, so 3 weeks ago, something like this, the ECOWAS meeting happened in Sierra Leone, and out of that came a communication about these particular issues regarding autonomous weapons systems and the impact that they will likely have on Global South nations, the African Union. A similar process occurred in Costa Rica, I think last year, about communications regarding these issues. And I think that that's showing global leadership from the South, and they're coming from a perspective where these are the impacts that they expect, given the geopolitical realities as well. And the concerns that they're raising are now coming into these international processes. And I think that that's where, again, a stark absence of the EU, a missed opportunity up until now, but it doesn't mean it's too late for them to also join forces here. So I think that the leadership we're seeing from blocs like ECOWAS and the Ibero-American community, those are things that we can learn from, lessons. And we have seen some of that happen. And just to pivot really quickly before I round off, but the Interparliamentarian Union came up with, at the end of March, a communique about a resolution, actually, that
What is
urges,
the Interparliamentarian Union?
this is a group of parliamentarians from around the world where they get together, they exchange best practices, they're in conversation with one another. This has worked really well at our national level. How can we translate that perhaps to other countries, etc.? It's brilliant because that's exactly the kind of strategic insight that I think our parliamentarians could use. But what they also do is come up with resolutions about expressing concerns that are of a global nature and how to bring this to the attention of national parliamentary members. And at the end of March, March 27th, there's a resolution on the effects of autonomous and semi-autonomous weapons systems. It's a 5-page document. It's a brilliant blueprint for us to start strategically engaging also with our new cabinet and members who are inclined to address these issues. So,
Maybe one topic, maybe bring in one topic that connects actually both, the role of Africa and the environment. You asked about the impact on the environment, and obviously we know in many ways AI has a great impact there. These large language models cost a lot of energy, all these data centers, it's tremendously, it costs a lot of energy. There's another angle that, of course, is also really important for AI to function and the utilization broader, and that's the use of certain natural resources. Specifically the rare earth metals. This is a sector that's crucial for anything digital. It's a sector that's mostly dominated by China. 60% of the supply chain of most rare earth metals is in Chinese hands. Also other metals, lithium, cobalt. Many of them also come from African countries. And here is a challenge also for us, because we use all these metals, we need all of them. We don't like mines, we're happy that it's done in other poor countries, and we just... That means China has completely controlled that supply chain, so we're at a geopolitical risk here, but also we are actually doing very little to alleviate the conditions under which these resources are mined. So this is, I think, a difficult challenge also for our model here. I mean, if we really are serious about more rights-based, maybe we should take more responsibility here, but that will also mean that our politicians will need to think about investing in mines. At least to do
Europe.
that in a way. In Europe, or maybe even other countries, but it's also in Europe.
Sometimes it needs to be outside of Europe.
Yeah, also there, but we don't want to touch it because it's dirty. So now we're just let others do it. It still happens in a worse way than if we were to have a role in it. But we're not responsible for it now, or at least we're not held accountable. So I think this is really a big challenge here.
But you can build robust rights
Yeah.
frameworks for fair trade supply chain.
Right.
That's
Of course.
where somewhere you can be
Yeah.
a leader on these issues,
Yeah.
even if you're not getting your hands dirty. as it were.
Right, yeah. So,
I think there's two things I would like to add. So the environmental issue is a huge issue. So we know that, as you were saying, large language models, all these models are consuming a lot of energy, and it's not renewable everywhere and not also here in this country. So something needs to be done there. And also specifically because it leads to kind of stupid examples, right? If you say, hey, Alexa, turn off the lights, that costs more energy than just leaving the lights on. So it's really something that we need to think about and how we're going to do that. And it's one of the things that, for instance, also my colleague Rob Jette is really looking into, and his ministry is looking into, as long as he's still there. But the other thing is about strategic autonomy. It was also in Mrs. Bradford's speech. One of the things that we're looking at in Europe is, following basically what we saw in the energy sector when the war in Ukraine started, or Russia attacked Ukraine, was that we were so dependent upon Russia. And now we're looking into this issue of being also in the digital field less dependent as Europe from other countries, from the rare earth metals or all the raw materials that we need to produce chips or to produce tools like phones and other stuff, but also to make sure that we're less dependent in infrastructure, to create more sea cables, to do the whole stack basically, so be able to have our own cloud systems, not putting all of our data in the US or somewhere else in the world. And that is something that is also a great topic and for the next Commission to think about, to make sure that we have this strategic autonomy, which is not the same as what Anno was saying, closing off the market, because that would be also a ridiculous thing to do. It is important that we keep our trades minds in, but also make sure that we're not too dependent upon certain states, whether it's the US or China or Russia or any other place in the world.
satellites, another one. Also, we've seen in Ukraine.
Yeah.
It's really Elon Musk that's holding up the communication of the Ukrainian military.
Starlink.
That's something that we really should develop alternatives for quickly.
Yeah. We have room for one more question from the audience, and then I'm afraid that we have to wrap up. Here. Oh, sorry, we're still waiting for the microphone so everyone can hear it. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. I would say, well, move fast, break things, and eat your own dog food. Those are the terms from Silicon Valley. So why not build a hyperscaler state? That the government provides the building, the infrastructure, the energy, and then everyone moves in. Then the defense, the police, the taxman, the ministries, and you have all the data together. The university built the system, and we all have a great party and build something great like we did with the waterworks in the Netherlands. So why don't we do that?
Wonderful question, thank you.
Yeah.
Why don't we do that?
We're doing actually something like that, but on a European scale. So we decided to create a new compute, which is, facility to make facilities for also smaller companies to have access to very, very, very fast and smart and huge computers and computer systems. So that's what we do. We provide that to startups, to smaller companies, and so on and so forth. But as I was saying in the beginning, this is something that we need to look into far more, to create more infrastructure, to make sure that everyone is connected, make sure that we have more compute, that we have computing power, that we create also those tools. But we definitely also need to look into, because of the energy consumption, into doing it smarter and making it use less compute and so on and so forth. But basically we're doing something like that, and we're not there yet. We're not connected enough. Well, the connectivity in the Netherlands is quite good, but in many places in Europe, people are still not having access to internet, for instance, which is not good, of course.
Haroon, how do you think about this ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where we need to look at, and we have in Europe lots of resources we can use much better. I mean, we are not enough pooling. The European countries are still competing with each other in many fields of AI. I mean, there's much more can be done by bringing that together. We have, I mean, the DARPA example was given, and you're right, I mean, we shouldn't use it in that form. But the simple idea that government procurement is a good tool. I mean, you've also worked on it. I mean, this is something Europe has. The government is such a big economic actor. We can ask the private sector to develop things that are important for us. That's also, the Americans are very good at this. I mean, that's one of the, in that way, it's not at all a free market model. I mean, it's the Department of Defense that's really stimulated all of their digital technologies. That is another resource we have in Europe, which the European Commission is increasingly looking towards, but that we can tap into. So I think there is a lot more potential that we can use to bring all these actors together, because yeah, Europe is very powerful here. But
we also should remain interesting for talent, because we can build all the infrastructure that we have, but if we don't have the people coming to do the jobs, and also the openness of our societies to have these people come in, we're nowhere.
Yeah, and this is something we really need to be honest to ourselves with. I mean, the direction it's going now. I mean, it's already, of course, we need a wake-up call to what the world thinks of the Netherlands now. I mean, there is already damage done, and so we should look hard in the mirror also at what we're doing right now here.
Actually, when I was in Europe today, so in the Commission, I mean, people are really, you know, they're laughing at us. That's basically it, but not in a good way.
Yeah, yeah.
And the guys from Poland said, you might want to talk to us because we just survived this and we can tell you how it's working. Yeah. No, but it's something that this is, and also in the we had a seat at the table at the G20, we were thrown out of the G20.
Yeah, 4 or 5 years, we were all the time. Lula said, no, the Dutch aren't coming.
Yeah.
India was planning on more partnership with the Netherlands. So let's see who's going to be on the picture with Modi. That's what they're waiting. So the damage is already being done.
So I have one final question, because we have the European elections, of course, just around the corner. If you were a European commissioner, what would be your first thing that you would do? I heard you, Alexandra, already saying something about strategic autonomy. Would that be your main focus?
It would be one of the focuses, but implementation of the digital rule book, as we call it, I would find very important. And the international cooperation, so the cooperation in the G20, in the United Nations, to make sure that we connect as much as we can people together. Yeah, those things I would really find important, yeah.
Haroon?
I mean, I think the strategic autonomy is really important to build on that. I mean, and maybe what priorities? Maybe first of all, I mean, we need to be careful, of course, with remaining open and everything in that. But we are far behind in the strategic view of the economy in terms of what China and the US is doing. We need to quickly learn how to do this. First of all, I think for me it involves a better understanding of how things work. I mean, we are also in the Netherlands working on trying to understand our strategic dependencies, but it is so much more is to be done there, and the complexity of understanding where these vulnerabilities are. And there's so much false views of if we just have this, or if we build another chip factory in Magdeburg, then it's gonna be fine. Not at all. I mean, the Chinese have been working for 30 years at looking every single vulnerability that is out there. We need a lot better understanding how the economy works, and not just in terms of how we can create it ourselves, but also if it's going to be disrupted, what are we going to do then? Also, maybe I think a next step in terms of more offensive capabilities, which is also hard for us. I mean, we're not normally here in Europe in the business of attacking others, but we need deterrence. We need to show in all kinds of sectors, well, if you're going to do this with the metals, or as has been done with the medicine during COVID, this is how we're going to hit back. This is what you need from us. And build on a few of those, because we don't have an entire internet ecosystem like the Chinese and the Americans have, but we can do, I think, what the Japanese call build on our strategic indispensability. Look, in every sector there's a part, and you're indispensable there. Everyone needs that. Build that and use that as a source of retaliation.
Like ASML is doing in the Netherlands.
It's one example that we have, but there should be much more. We should build on.
We should work on the whole stack, right? It's from the
in every
raw
layer it should be
materials
okay. If this chip is not coming, you're not getting
programming.
This. And these are, I think, important steps for us in terms of that. And then I think maybe finally, in terms of going further with the discussion of strategic autonomy, looking at a modern industrial policy. We are very afraid here of picking winners, but there are new ways of doing this, and especially many East Asian countries are leading the way here. I think not just China, it's also Japan, Korea that we can learn from. There are layers in the stack where we're quite strong. Networks, Nokia, Ericsson, they're the biggest companies behind Huawei. But we need to build on making sure that they're just as good or better than Huawei. And that requires a different mindset. And those are fields I think we really need to invest in, because certain other fields like the cloud, it's very hard to get into. But at certain fields where we're strong, we really need to think of a more modern industrial policy.
Thank you.
Well, we're working on that, that's true. Yeah.
What would you do as a European Commissioner?
Well, I would celebrate that I win.
Also important.
And then I'd roll up my sleeves. My sleeves are already rolled up, so that's a good start. But I think it's hard work. And we all have to do our homework and understand this is so complicated and complex, but that shouldn't scare us away from starting to understand we don't all need to become programmers, but we need to do better at understanding the technology in the ways that it's being developed throughout the life cycle. But that also includes assessment. A lot of times we don't talk about it. So I was really heartened to hear the midterm evaluations. The first thing that I would put on the agenda is, of course, dive into and take a leadership role on military AI in a regulatory way. And that would be something, right now at the UN, we're seeing a two-tiered approach, banning fully autonomous weapon systems that are non-compliant with legal frameworks that we already have established, and regulating the rest. The first part might be the easiest bit, and the rest of it is the hard work. But like I said, we have to roll up our sleeves and think through the ways in which we reflect on our being, our humanness, our humanity, centering humans in this discussion regarding military, but also other value-based sectors, is integral into in moving the discussion forward. And from the Defense Department's perspectives, there's starting to be a bigger movement toward protecting civilians as a moral and strategic imperative in reaching legitimacy of military operations. It's in their interests as well. And to underscore that protection of civilians can also be overlaid with how defense industries and defense departments are trying to deploy AI systems. Looking at those two things through the same lens rather than in a siloed way, I think is absolutely imperative. So that'd be my first day on the job.
Thank you. All right, please, a warm applause for the panels. Yeah, I just want to thank you all very much for coming here and for participating. Such interesting questions as well. Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you, Haroon. Thank you, Jessica. On behalf of the European Liberal Forum, Volres, and the Meester Hans van Mierlo Foundation, and D66 International, thank you very much. For now, we're closing up the formal part, but we are going to start the informal part. So until 10 o'clock, you can get drinks at the bar. We also have some merchandise lying over there from the European Liberal Forum and the Hans van Mierlo Foundation. We wrote a very interesting book called 14 Missies for Europa, with new thinkers on the future of the European Union. So have a look at it. And please don't forget to vote in June, between the 6th and the 9th of June, depending on the country where you live in. Please go vote for the European elections. Thank you.